Happy Friday. Welcome to another Friday Privacy Chat, where I talk about some of the big things happening this week for the real geeks of the data protection, AI governance, and compliance community, because a fellow geek here, Gabriela, sound for Fortuna, and we use geek in a nice way. We mean people who really are deeply interested in this work. It's not just because our salaries are paid working on it. This is a passion for us, and that's why we spend our careers, and the details and the complexity are important. So welcome, Gabriela, who many of you know leads our global team, meaning our staff in Singapore who work across APAC, based in Singapore with some senior fellows and some staffing as well in India. Our Brussels team operating across Europe, and our staffer in New York, speaking Spanish, who helps cover Latin America. Anyway, the world, most of the world has enormous amount of activity, and many of the regulators and policymakers have been influenced over the years by the GDPR. It was remarkable to me that there was fairly little recognition here, there, but not a lot. Gabriela posted about it. There were some things, but not a lot of activity around the world commemorating this 10th anniversary of not the date it went into effect, but the date that it passed, it became law. So we thought we'd at least have a bit of a conversation here for folks who've lived through the pre-GDPR, the years of negotiations. Gabriela, did we meet pre-GDPR when you had just kind of come to the US?
Was it was post GDPR? Yeah,
it was post GDPR.
Yes, I literally traveled to the US with the GDPR in my backpack because it was the text was adopted in April 2016. So we indeed celebrated 10 years this year after like on April 14th, after the last vote, which sealed it as a law. And it's true that the most famous date related to GDPR, it's May 25th, 2018, when it became applicable. But there are many folks in our community who remember that those 2 years in between April 2016 and May 2018 were absolutely crazy, were intense with compliance programs, legal counsel, outside counsel, trying to make sense of what is this new law that the European Union just adopted, and that will impact businesses around the world that want to do business in Europe. And it was just such an incredible time to work with companies, universities, all sorts of entities outside of the EU that had to absorb all of this concepts of data protection and privacy to an extent that they were not conceived before. And I happened, for personal reasons, to move to the US just a couple of months after the GDPR was adopted. And I was so fortunate to have some of that knowledge. So this is how I had the opportunity to be very close to the people who are paying attention to it and wanting to know what it is about.
Well, obviously, the reason that there are certainly perhaps not celebrations and commemorations is that everybody is focused on whether or not 10 years in, GDPR has well served or not. And so we'll leave that debate for the Brussels Privacy Symposium and for the Digital Omnibus and for other debates. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity there. But clearly consequential and something that drove lots of thoughtful work and expertise and compliance efforts, whether they always worked out for the best of individuals or for innovation or so forth. Let's leave to another time. I remember a year in, we called up the European Commission, the delegation, MC I call it, but it's not an MC because the European Union is not a country, and said, look, we should mark a year. I mean, we've all been working hard on this And they were shocked. They said, "You all hate the GDPR in Washington. What do you mean?" I said, "Look, whether or not we would like to debate significant issues, this has been consequential, and let's do some program taking stock, a year in." And so we did a nice program with the ambassador and so forth. But one of the things that surprised me the most, as somebody who worked in Europe on data protection issues long before GDPR, so much of GDPR was already reflected in the regulation, was reflected in local laws, the directive, right? Remember, for listeners who clearly as geeks know this, but right, on the US or sometimes international side, a directive might be a law and a regulation might be details promulgated by lower authorities. Regulation, of course, as we know from GDPR, is law across the European Union, while the directive was a directional document that countries were supposed to conform but didn't have direct applicability. But that being said, every country had a data protection law which generally conformed with the directive, which really resembles a little less detail, not every section, not every clause, but the basic notion of needing a legal basis. I think it was the same, right? There were no, maybe one country had differences, but the directive had the same notion of needing a legal basis, of necessity, of proportionality, rights to delete. And so the amazing sort of shock across Europe, what is this thing we need to comply with? I was like, wait a second. You supposedly were complying with this for quite a long time. Okay, fine. Maybe the attention, the penalties, and the budgets that were finally obtained by some of the regulators. But what has always frustrated me, and maybe you can add some light here, in many jurisdictions, you have, words, and there's some confusion about exactly what they mean in particular use cases, when new technologies and so forth. And there's litigation, and there are court decisions. And you can look back, and it seemed like everyone started from zero when it came to the GDPR, with some caveats. You could look at decisions. I mean, employees having access was not new. And this was a right that was always, some say abused, others say, used, but always used by employees who often had issues with their employer and wanted to get access to data and would go to court with their counsel because they were going to, make complaints against their former employer, and they wanted all the information. And so you have years and years of court decisions, certainly in the UK and in some other jurisdictions, but we're still, however many years in, sometimes debating and having the ECJ have to give us guidance about what is consent and what is passing a legitimate interest test. And why, can you help me understand why was there not as much jurisprudence? Is it indeed because many of the DPAs were rarely actually bringing cases that went to court that gave us sort of decisions? Deirdre Mulligan and Ken Bamberg are prominent academics, famously wrote a book pre-GDPR about privacy on the books, privacy on the ground, and they were challenging the notion that Europe had strong privacy law and the US didn't, because they saw that although it was mostly FTC and it was sector specific, there was this big culture of compliance with the laws and litigation and enforcements and so forth around what was in place, while it was more an on the books system in Europe with less real strict enforcement. So maybe that's the answer, but what's your...
That's a great question, and I share your I'll call it frustration on my side, but I share your puzzlement, let's say, on this. And this is also the story of how I became so obsessed with data protection many years ago in my last year of law school, when preparing for a moot court competition on EU law, I had to read about the directive, what's it all about. I saw that in my country, which was a member of the EU, Romania, we had a law already in place for about 10 years at that point. But as a law student, I've never even heard of those concepts as a user, student, or any sort of data subject. I had no idea I had rights. And I was wondering, how can such a far-reaching law, if you look at the words and you understand how broad personal data processing, how broad the scope is from universities to your hospital, to your tax agency, to the companies, wherever, I was absolutely shocked that nothing was actually happening around me that had any connection to it. There were no cases, there were no judgments to look at. And I started with this thread, with following this dissonance in a way. And this is how I ended up as an intern at the European Data Protection Supervisor. I literally, in my interview, I told them, look, I've seen this law. I know how broad it is, how important it is, but I don't know how it works in practice. I'd love to learn a bit from somebody that's actually doing this, how it goes outside of the theory and into practice. And I'm not exactly sure why the law did not have a life in it, at least before the GDPR.
With some exceptions. There was a very active UK, again, it was, as has been history, interpreted more flexible, perhaps because they actually were using it as opposed to some of the other countries that were on the books. They had a big economic and commerce world, and were with some flexibility, but there were decisions. There was some degree of jurisprudence. Spain was often going around handing out fines and so forth. I don't know how much jurisprudence there was. So if any of our listeners are aware or want to make the case that in a particular country there really was, and maybe because it's in German or something, we're not, as well aware. But I think we properly diagnosed that. So okay, so GDPR, because it was European-wide, because it had penalties, because of the amount of digital. I mean, a lot of this other data protection law was before the digital explosion. So it wasn't maybe even that interesting that if there were records and it was a computer and there were a file, you could have some rights. I mean, we didn't have as much automated processing. We didn't have as much go to a website and hundreds of things are happening. We didn't have mobile apps. So it might have just been a much more boring, dusty sort of less consequential to everybody's life. And GDPR really came into place as the internet was really in this very acceleration phase. And suddenly we had to determine what, in all of these digital contexts, these words, which might have simply been, you checked into a hotel and there was a box on the page you signed that acknowledged some data protection rights. All of a sudden, there's cookies, there's downloads, there's tick boxes and all sorts of defaults and so on and so forth. Okay. What else do you think from those early days is worth flagging and mentioning?
I would say that one of the most surprising things that I don't think folks in Brussels working on the GDPR during the legislative process were expecting was the impact it had outside of the European Union. And it's true that one of its key changes was a much clearer language around extraterritorial effect. However, I remember talking to some of my friends in Brussels a couple of years after the GDPR entered into force about how shocked they were, it created a sort of a new job market, even, let's say, outside of Europe, with, of course, compliance offices and so forth. And you would think that folks would think this is a consequence if you make a far-reaching sort of law that has extraterritorial effect. But perhaps until you actually see it happening, you don't realize just the type of effect it had. So that was one of the things. The other thing that speaking also on this global effects, the other thing that I believe it's remarkable is the impact on public policies of other countries, very, very big jurisdictions. And in the after the adoption of the GDPR, we've seen many of the biggest democracies around the world adopting similar laws, of course, taking into account their legal culture. And I think, for instance, India is kind of the best example of that, where we have some concepts, of course, from the GDPR, but then a lot of things very unique to India that are present in their general data protection law. We've seen that in Brazil as well with the LGPD. And to me, it was just remarkable to look at this expansion of data protection, general data protection law in other jurisdictions, anchored in the same concepts and principles. And this quest of understanding, but then what are the differences when these laws start to be applied in those particular jurisdictions, was in fact a big driver of the work we're doing at FPF on the global side around the world, right? Trying to understand how this happens in practice in very specific jurisdictions. So I would note this extraterritorial effect very, very as very important consequences and things that we should highlight on the GDPR.
Yeah, so I'll argue. I don't want to take over in this limited amount of time we have the what works and what doesn't work well about GDPR, but just given that we sort of talked about the fact that there were so many court cases, so much need for guidance, so much need for interpretation, my argument has been that the bigger issue than any particular clause that needs to be updated, the biggest issue where GDPR has been an overhang on research or innovation or so on and so forth, has been the fact that it has taken years and years to interpret, and sometimes in ways that were very at odds with what most of the legal experts, counseling would have said, because of decisions that either DPAs made or that courts made. So it's that frothy uncertainty. Is this allowed? Is it not allowed? Okay, it's allowed, but Facebook is now having an enforcement against it. But that's really just because of Facebook and social media. That's not relevant to other people. Okay, yes, it is relevant to other people. That's just for ad tech. No, it turns out, right? And so it's been the confusion, and I urge everyone who's paying attention to the US legislative process. We will very soon have, a Republican energy and commerce bill, that has been well socialized with lots of stakeholders and lots of members of Congress, and TBD how much support and democratic engagement. So leaving aside the political process, but it will be consequential because it will show some consensus, at least in one of the four houses, around a model that will be very reflective of some of the states. And that's probably the path forward. GDPR, as we said, built on law that was already in place. All of the earlier US federal efforts were taking place without as expansive a state landscape, and didn't really have a lot of consensus, and really went in some very unusual directions. It was as if sort of people were just pulling together different ideas. So very logical to assume that we're at the beginning of a process here where anybody who proposes a national law, certainly if it's intended to preempt or to, coexist with the states, is going to reflect significant rights that are already in place, sometimes for a couple of years. And, in large part, that's what we anticipate. The bigger issue than whether or not any particular activity is treated in one way or another is going to be the clarity and the understanding that this is allowed and this is not. Because when it's not super clear, it's years, this is what we saw with GDPR, of debate, of litigation, some actors complying, others not. Then everyone else stops complying because some are not. Startup doesn't comply. I mean, the frothiness, and everyone is connected in this digital world. Every company is connected. You can't be a good actor when your vendors and your partners and all the service providers you work with maybe have a different view of the definition of personal information. This is what happens today, and is, I think, one of the negatives in terms of compliance. People who want to do the right thing have a hard time doing so because they have to rely on partners and vendors and so on and so forth, who may not have the same, consensus sort of view. So learn one thing from GDPR, less, the rules were too strict. Maybe they were in some cases, maybe they're not, but get clear guidance and certainty so that companies can compete with a level playing field.
Absolutely. Absolutely agreed on that one. And this is where we, perhaps that's the positive for the US not having yet a federal comprehensive privacy law. Perhaps, that's the positive that we can learn from what happened post GDPR. We can also potentially gear it from the get-go to the age of AI, so that there won't be at any point in the near future a need for broader, stricter, technology-focused on AI, other type of regulation, if the biggest of harms could potentially be tackled through a federal privacy law.
And look, I do want to urge policymakers to look closely at GDPR. Everything can't be bad. That's sort of the vibe in Washington. Oh, that's bad. There are lots of parts that took a lot of work, a lot of crafting, are being complied with broadly by companies around the world already. So there's some logic to conformity and consistency when it's working well, or sometimes maybe it's not perfect, but it's working well enough. And the value of interoperability and uniformity and working to work with the tools that are already in place. Sometimes we see some of the states and even some of the industry lobbyists looking to, in each state, get a little bit of an advantage. And a lot of our folks who are more legal and compliance, if it's the same and I'm already working with it and that's the deal in this state and that state and that state, I really would rather, even though you're going to give me a little extra margin over here, you've actually just created a complexity that doesn't work when I'm running a national program, I'm running a global program. So I'll trade off a little bit of some option over here that, in theory might have given some room, because I want to draw a reasonable line. So really decent reasons to not shun GDPR, to understand where researchers tell us they have some problems. They want to do important, valuable health research, societal research. Where is there friction? Where are there really business clashes? Where is AI, in tension? But on many of the other areas where there is good logic, please don't reinvent things and create, complexity. Look and understand what people like, what businesses like, what consumers like, and accept a little bit of influence. Because guess what? They didn't make it up there. A lot of this is built not just on previous data protection law, but on the fair information practices and the early US concepts that were really important drivers So you don't have to say it wasn't invented here, so we don't like it. It was invented here, or at least co-invented by people who are thinking through these issues and influencing each other, in the very early days of thinking about these digital issues.
100% agreed with you here. And I think this is one of the things that's not, unfortunately, that well known across policymakers today on privacy issues. Most of these concepts were actually thought through and laid out in the early 70s in the US. And exactly, it's not that if we continue to use those that have proved to be workable, it's a foreign influence. These are standards and principles that have been working across borders, following an intellectual process and efforts that had a lot of American input at the very beginning.
It was even a legal process. The Privacy Act was more than 50 years old. The U.S. Privacy Act, which, again, we extended it only to government, but this was the follow-up to those fair information practices developed at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, at the behest of a congressional committee.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
All right. Well, it's beautiful outside, and I'm going to try to get a little bit of fresh air before jumping into the next meeting. Thank you for joining me. Note that I think we posted the save the date for the Brussels Privacy Symposium. Did we ever?
We did. Yes. Tuesday, October 13.
Tuesday, October 13. We will be looking at 10 years back, but actually, more importantly, 10 years forward to take a look not only at how the GDPR is working, but how it is intersecting in a perhaps conflict of values or an effort to balance values of competition, of platforms, all the digital omnibus reforms. So we'll be deep into that process by then in terms of the European legislative process. So if you're in Europe, you gotta come. It's local in Brussels. If you're global, you are quite welcome. We'll have some special events around it as well. And you are all invited. So, Gabriela, thank you for joining me today, and we'll wish you all a happy Friday.
Happy Friday, everyone.